Hello, folks. Welcome to a special interview event here at Duende. We're going to be talking to a web security expert. We're really excited to have him here today. He is Philippe De Ryck, and he is the founder of Pragmatic Web Security. We also have Martin with us today, joining in on the conversation. And yeah, this should be fun. So welcome, Philippe. Welcome, and thank you for doing this interview with
Yeah,
us.
of course. No worries. Happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about anything you have for me. So yeah, let's go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
so go ahead, Martin.
I guess we can start with quick introductions. Can you introduce yourself a little bit? What is Pragmatic Web Security? What is it you do, and all of those things?
All right. That's a very simple question with a very hard answer. In a nutshell, what I do is I help developers understand web security. So I'm a security expert, web security expert, more specifically, and my company is called Pragmatic Web Security, and through my company, I basically help developers understand security in all forms and formats. So I do a lot of training, like 1 day, 2 day workshops in companies at conferences, stuff like that, on a variety of topics like front-end security, API security, OAuth, OIDC, stuff like that. And then the second aspect is I have some online courses where I teach similar topics to people interested in learning that. And then finally, I also consult. So I do a lot of, well, not a lot. I do some, like 1/3 of my time, I would say, I spend on consulting, which is actually pretty fun. So I join a company, probably a couple of hours per week or per month, depending on what they need. And we talk through scenarios. We talk through problems they're facing, challenges they have, and how security plays a role, what they can do, and so on. And it's basically my job to help them understand the problems they're facing, understand the potential solutions, and make a choice forward, like how to solve things. And yeah, that's basically how I spend my days.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I've watched a lot of your NDC talks, and Pragmatic Web Security, the name of your company. Watching those talks, it's very pragmatic. When you're a web security expert, what do you think the web entails? Because the web is kind of this nebulous concept. What encompasses web security these days?
Yeah, it's one of these topics where you can pull in like all kinds of things, right? Especially if you start talking about like Web3 and all of those concepts, it gets like very fuzzy really fast. And for me, web security, like I said, I work with developers, so we kind of work on the security you can control from building your web applications. So that means you have to assume a couple of things, like you have to assume that the hardware you're building on, the browsers people are using are all trustworthy, because as a software developer, as a web application developer, you can't control any of that. So in my work, we typically assume that a user is using a non-compromised, standards compliant browser. And then we start building on top of that, like using the browser security model for certain boundaries, enforcing those in the front end, and then building on top of that. So in my view, web security fits in that window, or that's my perspective on web security, because that's what I work with most. But of course, there's so much other stuff going on, like the people building browsers, doing all kinds of exciting things, new APIs that have an impact on security, can make things better or worse, depends a bit on what's being built. So yeah, that plays a role as well. And then of course we have all of these new approaches that are hooked into web-based applications as well. And then of course AI plays a major role as well. So yeah, it's a very open-ended topic, and my focus is mostly on helping people that build applications, helping them make it more secure and doing it right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's super interesting. I'm actually wondering, if you go to a customer and you look at all of the different applications they are building and so on, what are the typical vulnerabilities and threats that you see today in the markets?
Yeah. Again, you guys ask like these majorly open-ended questions that has me thinking for a bit. Like you have the classics, right? So when I teach front-end security, we talk about things like cross-site scripting, and we talk about using security patterns to make things better. So yes, these definitely play a role. What I run into most is not necessarily vulnerability vulnerabilities per se, because I don't do pen tests. Like I'm not going to go in and find the weaknesses. I really don't have the patience to do that, to be honest. But I help people that already know that they have an issue or want to do things better. That's where I come in, and usually it's more on the architectural level, more on the making decisions and approaching things of how they want to do it. Usually it happened because they went down a path, whether it was the right or the wrong one, doesn't really matter. But eventually they run themselves they got kind of stuck in that path. Like, crap, now we have all of these problems, and how do we solve this, and so on. So yeah. On the API side, authorization plays a major role. Authentication as well, like service-to-service authentication plays a role, but also the user-facing part with OAuth. So all of that stuff, but a bit less on identifying vulnerabilities and a bit more on best practices and getting things right.
Yeah. It's interesting. The first step to making a change for the better is either being like dissatisfied or knowing you have a problem. So hearing that your clients know that they can do better and want to do better, I think is very interesting from a security perspective. So that's really good to hear. But speaking of that, I watched your NDC talk and something stuck out. It's kind of funny when you said it in the talk. And I'd like you to repeat some of it here, but you said security in the web was kind of okay, and then we added auth 2.0 to the front end, and then everything went wrong, right? So can you explain that to people who are potentially building, OAuth 2 into front end and SPA applications? What do you mean by we added auth 2.0 to the front end and now we made things worse, right?
Yeah. If you take that little quote out of the whole talk, then yeah, it sounds really bad. Thanks for doing that. No, the reason I put that in the talk is to kind of bring the point across. Like I have it on a slide. It's one of my takeaways, like adding OAuth in the front end makes things worse. It's because the story is so nuanced and so detailed that people often glance over. It's like, yeah, doesn't seem too bad. It's probably fine. So I added something in there to make it like really clear. And apparently it works, because that's the thing you remembered. So that's good.
Yeah.
So what is this about? And this is also something I've been working on a lot the last couple of years. So when we build web applications, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to start talking about web applications in general. When we build web applications, there's this uneasy feeling of the presence of malicious JavaScript, right? Whenever you think about a front end, you have to think about like, oh no, what if the attacker can execute some JavaScript code? We have cross-site scripting where you handle data in the front end insecurely, which tends to be a fairly common problem. And then all of a sudden, this data, like a restaurant review that you're rendering, bam, it pops into executable JavaScript code, which is insane if you think about it from a security perspective, but it is a very big reality in web applications. And we have other cases, like if you pull in a JavaScript file from a remote host, maybe it's a third-party component you're pulling in, or a library from a CDN. If that one is compromised, again, you're pulling in malicious code and it runs in your application. And this has always been a problem, right? I don't have an exact timestamp on when this became a problem, but it's at least 20 years and a little bit longer, I think 22 or 23 years since somebody first thought of like, this doesn't seem like a very good idea. And we've always had this issue. And when this happens, there's kind of this general understanding that the attacker can do anything in JavaScript code that basically the JavaScript language and APIs allows them to do. And in the early days, like when we're building server-side applications with PHP or GSP pages or whatever, then you would have the attacker trying to steal the session cookie. That was the big thing back then, session hijacking, like, I'm going to read the cookie and steal it, and now I am the user and I can do whatever I want. And that's why we have things like HTTP-only cookies, where you hide the cookie from JavaScript. Doesn't really solve the problem. There's like a lot of misunderstanding in that area as well. Like, yeah, it seems to solve cross-site scripting. No. It solves one of the symptoms, stealing that session cookie, but the attack factor stays the same. And kind of the worst that was possible in these types of applications is the attacker modifying the behavior of the application, sending requests to the backend as if they are the application. And it's basically what we call client hijacking, or taking control of the user's browser, pretending to be them. And it's an online attack, meaning that once the JavaScript code executes in the browser, it can run, but the moment you close the browser, the attack goes away, right? Because if there's no browser, there's no code, and the problem goes away.
Mm-hmm.
If you take that as a baseline, so that's essentially what I'm aiming at with the quote in my talk. If that is the baseline, and you start looking at what we do with frontends, all of a sudden now you're running OAuth flows in frontends. They're public clients; they don't have client authentication to your authorization server. And one of the attack factors that the attacker can execute is running a silent flow in an iframe, which is a very common pattern. Like every OAuth library that you find for frontends does this by default, almost all of them. And the attacker can now do exactly the same. And that means that the attacker can complete a full flow, a full OAuth flow, obtain tokens, an access token and a refresh token, and then exfiltrate those tokens to a server they control. And all of a sudden, the attacker has executed an attack that gives them tokens in the name of the user to access whatever servers that the frontend is accessing in a non-online way, as in, even if the user closes their browser, goes away, the attacker still has these tokens and can still use them for as long as they're valid, which can be up to hours or days or even longer, depending on the application. Now, bringing it back to the code in the talk, if you compare modern frontends with OAuth to these legacy applications, legacy between quotes, because it's still a very valid pattern, but these older style of applications, if you analyze the security properties, then we actually have made it worse, because we went from this client hijacking attack vector to all these other things that the attacker can do. And that's essentially the nuanced explanation behind that very, very explicit and dramatic quote that we made things worse. But that's essentially what this is all about.
Yeah, the web is a scary place, and it's like, it's funny you say like developers, are thinking through these scenarios and thinking of these complex ones, but sometimes simple ones will get you too, and that's what attackers are looking for. Knowing that we've made this mistake and transitioned OAuth 2 into the browser, I know you do work with the IETF, the best current practices. What are the best current practices when it comes to building secure web applications?
Well, the best practice would be the use of a backend for frontend, a BFF. So what I'm doing with IETF is there's this spec, the OAuth spec for browser-based apps, and it's this document that has been around for a couple of years. And what basically happened is it evolved into something like a document that was aware of this malicious JavaScript attack vector and then focused heavily on protecting the tokens. Like, what if we can prevent a token from being stolen while ignoring the fact that the attacker can just run a silent flow and obtain their own tokens? And this kind of grew a bit, and people added more impractical patterns to try and stop certain attacks from happening very ineffectively, I must say. And what happened is, in my trainings, I'm teaching OAuth to a group of developers, 40 people, and I'm like ripping on this spec. Like, yeah, here's a spec for browser-based apps, and this is what it says, and it's bullshit because of these reasons, and so on. And that doesn't feel right? And I was like just a very uncomfortable feeling, and didn't make sense. And I raised the issue on a mailing list, like, yeah, but there's all kinds of issues here, and it kind of went like nowhere. It's like, didn't really have an impact. So I decided, and that's one of the first NDC talks on this topic 2 years ago, I decided to build some demos. I was like, I'm going to show people that this actually doesn't work. So I built a demo with cross-site scripting, and I have this payload, and I inject it, and we bypass refresh token rotation because it's very meaningless. And then we run this silent flow and obtain fresh tokens. And that was like an eye-opener. I did the same talk for the OAuth security workshop. So this is a gathering of all the people working on OAuth with a focus on security. And I did the same talk with the people in the room that actually write the spec. And I was like, yeah, this doesn't really work well. And they're like, yeah, we kind of see it now. And then I proposed, like, do you want some help with making this clear in the spec and fleshing this out, and so on and so on? And they were like, yes, please. And that's how that happened. And we basically, I helped rewrite the entire document. So somewhere around version 14, 15, you can see there's like a massive change. And we added all of these threats and attack vectors to make it very clear. And then you have the architectural patterns listed as well, one of which is the BFF. And then you have the third one is basically OAuth in the browser. And then you have like an in-between where you have a BFF that shares the access token with the front end. It's kind of a weird thing for some specific use cases, I would say. And each of these patterns is mapped through the threads. So you basically can make a mapping like, here's some of the risks of malicious JavaScript, here's the patterns, which pattern meets or fixes, mitigates which attack vectors. And then you can see that the BFF basically brings security back to where we are at the baseline. Client hijacking, that's never going to go away. That's just the way the web is. And that's something we have to deal with. And that's the best we can do with the backend for frontend. And then the pattern with OAuth in the browser doesn't mitigate any of the threats. And of course, it gives you a very informed opinion about what it means to do OAuth in the browser. And then, of course, it's up to the people implementing this to decide what they want to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
That's so. Can you explain a little bit for folks who are just tuning in and just watching this interview? What is the BFF exactly? Like, how does it work architecturally? How do components fit together?
Yeah, of course. So a BFF is a backend for frontend. It's basically if you have your frontend application and you have your API here, and the frontend is calling the API with an access token, we basically add like a third component to the frontend, a backend for frontend, like a backend component that handles OAuth. That's basically it. So you remove OAuth from the frontend. Yeah, you can delete the OAuth library you're using in your frontend, and you instead use a backend component that handles OAuth. And then it proxies API calls. It receives a call from the frontend, and it forwards that call to the API with the right access token. And then the third component that a BFF has is session management. It uses a securely configured cookie, like a cookie following all security best practices, to keep track of the tokens, which can be a server-side session with tokens. That's one option. Or the most common option is just to store token information in the cookie, preferably encrypted, but it can also be unencrypted, and keep track of the users' tokens with that cookie when interacting with the browser. And that's essentially the three building blocks of a BFF. So one of the confusions here is like, so is it an API gateway? It's like, not really, because the BFF belongs to the client, right? So every front end that would have like an OAuth client ID would now have a backend for front end with an OAuth client ID and a client secret. It's now a confidential client, and so on. And that's basically where the security benefits of the BFF come from.
Mm-hmm. So if I have a single page application and I'm hypothetically doing OAuth in the client and want to migrate over to a BFF solution, this all sounds really complex. Is it difficult to migrate from a single page application doing OAuth in the client to now doing this BFF pattern? From your experience working with clients, is it difficult? Like, what's the ability to kind of migrate to this?
Yeah. It sounds complex until you fully understand what exactly BFF does, and then it's going to click. It's like, oh yeah, that's actually not that hard. So I actually, when I teach about this, I have this slide, like, what do you have to change? On the API side, nothing changes. Your API was receiving requests with access tokens. It still receives requests with access tokens. On your authorization server, you have to change a client from a public client to a confidential client, standard features. So it's a minor, it takes like 1 minute to make that change, and done. On the front end, things get easier. So you can rip out the whole OAuth stuff. That makes things a lot easier. And then the final part is, of course, you have to add BFF. And that can be complex, depends on how you want to approach this. So if you want to use an existing BFF, like there's this company Duende, so you guys have a BFF library that's available. Yeah. You can actually use that to implement the BFF, and then it's literally 10 minutes of work, something like that, to configure that library and set it up. And all it needs is configuration, because the BFF does not contain business logic. It has a session management mechanism that exists in any language. It has an OAuth client that you can easily find for backend web applications, very easy. And it has a proxy component that many languages today also have ready to go as a component. So it's a matter of hooking things up and configuring things. And that's all there is to it. So effort-wise, it depends on, of course, your architecture, but effort-wise, it shouldn't be that hard once you understand how this works. But yeah, your mileage may vary. I was talking to a client earlier this week, and they're like, yeah, we have 400 to 500 applications. Well, switching them over to BFF is going to be a journey. But on the practical side, like one application making the change, it's actually going to make things easier once you have everything in place.
Wow, that is a lot of clients. So best of luck to your customer.
So question on what you see in terms of customer adoption of the BFF pattern, for example. Do you see a lot of companies realize that, okay, having OAuth in the browser is not the correct way to handle things. We want to migrate to BFF and we want to do this short term, or do you see this more of a journey that a lot of companies and a lot of your customers are continuing to take?
It depends on the company and the business they're in. So when talking to financial customers, like people in the financial industry, they're like, yeah, backend for frontend, of course it makes sense. Like we don't care about any overhead or anything like that. Yes, backend for frontend, it's the only logical choice. Done. Other scenarios are somewhat more challenging, because when I've noticed from experience, when you tell people like, yeah, what you're doing is wrong, you have to do this, then the natural instinct is like, yeah, but, and there's like this denial phase where they're trying to find reasons of why it's still fine to do and this and that. And it depends a bit on the type of application you're building and how strict your security requirements are. Because yes, we make things less secure by doing OAuth in the browser, but maybe what you're building is not that critical, and you have a very good control over your JavaScript code. You are very certain that you can manage cross-site scripting, which for some people is true, and that all has an impact on whether you need a BFF or not. But in general, and that's also one of the slides in the talk you saw, in general, my advice is like every application handling personal data or sensitive data needs to use a BFF. It's the only logical choice, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we all overestimate our ability to do certain things. And when it comes to security, those are one of the areas that I feel like maybe I shouldn't overestimate my own ability to keep things secure.
That's because it's a rigged game, right? You are
Right?
building an application and you have to get it right every single time. For example, you render data in the front end, you have to get it right. And if you make one mistake, you lose and the attacker wins. And that's essentially the whole challenge with this approach. Like, yes, it's going to be fine. And yes, if you are on the top of your game every single time you're writing code, then yes, it's going to be perfectly fine, until you make a mistake, until there's Monday morning code or an intern or somebody new starts and they make a silly mistake, a silly copy paste error from AI in these cases, from ChatGPT or from Stack Overflow in the old days, a silly mistake, and bam, you have a problem. And the main issue is these issues are not going to jump up and say like, look at me, I'm a mistake. It's only going to pop up if you actually go looking for them, or if somebody else finds it for you and hopefully reports it, or in the worst case exploits it. And then it's like, oh yeah, crap.
Yeah. So one last question about, front ends. I noticed right behind you, you have an Angular drawing from probably Angular Conf that you went to. When people have front end applications, does BFF only work for something like Angular or React? Like, who is BFF for if you have a particular front end framework?
Yeah. All right. First, the drawing is from NGBE, the Belgian Angular conference, and they have amazing speaker gifts. So yeah, it's so they actually had an artist draw like cartoons of every speaker. So that was pretty awesome. A BFF is basically for any type of front end trying to access APIs with OAuth, I would say. Then the BFF is going to be a very logical choice to do that. It works, of course, really well with modern frontends like Angular and React and Vue and Svelte and all of those things. But it works for any type of JavaScript application, basically. Anything in the browser interacting with APIs can benefit from a BFF. I've seen people use it for like these mobile apps that are actually web apps running in like a browser-based environment. They would benefit from a BFF as well, for sure. And to be honest, BFFs make a lot of front-end scenarios easier. Things like micro front-ends, where you're all of a sudden stuck with like, oh, how do we share tokens between these different components? Well, you no longer have to, because a BFF will just include the cookie. Well, in the BFF pattern, the cookie will be included on your calls, and everything will be handled from there. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really nice. I mean, from an enterprise perspective, I know teams sometimes dabble with like React and Angular and Vue kind of all within the same application. So adopting BFF doesn't mean you have to switch your front end approach or even give up any, flexibility when it comes to building front ends. So that's really good to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And it removes some of the responsibilities for front-end developers. It makes their lives easier. The major hurdle is getting your BFF pattern and installation into place. And once you have that, once you can deploy a BFF for a front-end, then it becomes really, really easy to use that for other applications as well.
Mm-hmm.
Super nice. Just a quick question before we start wrapping up and so on. We opened this with an introduction. You mentioned your company name is Pragmatic Web Security. We were wondering, have you ever seen some unpragmatic approaches to security? And how did you help those folks?
Unpragmatic. Okay. Yeah. So two things come to mind. So sometimes I join a team where they're having like major discussions, and some people are like, no, we want to do it the right way and this and that security wise. But sometimes people tend to push it too far, because security is I open all my trainings with this slide where security is like this scale. It's a gradient slide going from red to green, and security is all of it, and it highly depends on your requirements, on what you're building, because you can push things so far that it becomes so impractical, and so expensive that it's not going to be realistic to do that for your company. So that's definitely one of the things I contribute with is balancing the requirements with the actual security and see where you need to be. And then the other aspect I see is people doing things like inserting components and building an architecture where things become so impractical because they took this path and they just keep building on that. So usually when I join a team and we work on the architectural level, I start with a meeting. The first meeting, I just ask questions. So they explain things. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you, like, why is that thing there? What does it do? And then sometimes it happens that like the second or third question, like, oh yeah, actually we don't need that. And boom. And the whole path they were in, just because they didn't have that perspective anymore, just dissolves, and they're like, oh yeah, we can take this direction now. And then things get a lot easier and clear. And I fully understand how that works, because, well, that's how we all work together, and what you do with colleagues as well, and what I do when I talk to other people, it's getting some other perspectives, and that definitely helps. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like sometimes on a project, you just keep going in a certain direction. It's like swimming like a shark. You can only go forward. And a lot of people don't have time to retrospectively look back at their decisions. So it's nice to have people like you come in and give that perspective, especially on the security side of things. So on that note, we're coming to an end of this interview. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed this conversation.
Yep.
But you talked about the gradient of security. What's something people could take away and do today in their code base that would tick that gradient closer to green? Do you have any advice?
Yes, my advice would be to avoid having to think about security. And it's based on this observation that, well, the whole industry is starting to make from the last decade or 2 decades of security. And we've given developers these guidelines, all right? These giant documents of guidelines of, this is what you have to do here, and this is what you have to do there. Watch out for this, watch out for that. And it turns out it doesn't work. It turns out that there's so much to take into account only for security, and developers have performance and accessibility and all of these things to keep in mind as well. And there's so much stuff that it becomes impossible to do it right all the time. Like we talked earlier, there's going to be a mistake at some point. So what works really well is designing patterns and coding guidelines that just do things the right way without having to think about it. For example, if you want to output HTML, instead of thinking about, like, I have to sanitize this every time I output HTML, why don't you make a component, like a React component, safe HTML, that outputs safe HTML? And the coding guideline becomes, instead of you have to sanitize every time you do this, like, no, you just use this component for outputting HTML, nothing else, bam. At that moment, you don't have to think anymore, because it happens automatically. And that's actually something The pattern is called Guardrails for Developers, and it's basically something that seems to be a lot more feasible on scale, because everything is fine if you're like a one-man team. You can probably write very good code if you're like a lead developer. But if you're building applications with dozens or hundreds or thousands of developers, it's going to be, there's so much influx of new people and people leaving, and it's going to be impossible to impart these coding guidelines. And these guardrails definitely help with that. So my advice is look at that and start building your own guardrails for how you want to build applications.
That's great advice.
Good advice, yes. Yeah. On that note, I guess this is the end of the interview, and we can start wrapping up. Just before we leave, is there anything else you want to give to people? Where can people find you, for example, on social media or on websites?
Yeah, so my website, pragmaticwebsecurity.com. That's going to be very easy, and my name is very distinguished. So if you remember my name, then I'm going to be very easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Blue Sky, Mastodon, so for sure. And of course, you can catch me at some conferences as well. So absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this interview. We really enjoyed it. A lot of great information. Hopefully, folks check you out. You did mention Duende BFF. Folks, check that product out as well. We'd really appreciate it. And on that note, thank you so much, Philippe. We'll see you later.
Very welcome. It was a pleasure to be here. So awesome.